Welcome. Oh, we've got a good crowd already.
I couldn't find the button.
Thank you for joining us today. We will get started in 2 minutes. Welcome to today's webinar. As we're waiting for folks to kind of keep trickling in, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We're so happy you're here with us. I think it's going to be a great webinar today. Lots of Delaware. We did see that on the registration. Welcome, Delaware. Philly, Georgia. I saw Kansas. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started right at 1 o'clock. East Coast time, I should say. Okay. All right, here we go. We'll just jump right in. So, the National Center for Adoption Competent Mental Health Services is proud to host today's webinar, which will be a unique live conversation with Laura Dernoot Lipsky, founder of the Trauma Stewardship Institute and author of the groundbreaking book, Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others and the age of overwhelm. My name is Erin Bader, and I am the Director of Knowledge and Dissemination for the National Center. And so we'll go into just kind of a brief overview. It's pretty simple of what we're going to do today. We're going to spend the first 20 minutes watching an excerpt from Laura's TED Talk, Beyond the Cliff. And then Laura is going to join us for 40 minutes of live Q&A and a great conversation. So if you be thinking as you're watching the video, or if you've read her book or seen any of Laura's other talks, be thinking of any questions you'd like to ask her, and you can put them in the chat, and I will pose the questions to her when she joins us here in a little bit. So this is a quote from Laura. When we refer to trauma, exposure response, we are talking about the ways in which the world looks and feels like a different place to you as a result of your doing your work. Laura, in this talk that we're going to watch, offers us a window into the cumulative toll that can occur when we, as caregiving professionals, are exposed to the suffering, hardship, crisis, or trauma. So we're going to jump right into the video. Gotta get past those ads always. Oh,
later as a near psychotic break. It would be fair for you to ask if I had always been that on edge, and the answer is no. But as many of you, I imagine, can relate to, how I found myself on top of that cliff on that particular day was by way of a very long road. Like so many others, my childhood was filled with a lot of love and many challenges. Life came into particularly sharp focus for me when I was 10 years old. My mom, who was the healthiest person any of us knew, went into a doctor's appointment for what everyone thought would be a diagnosis of pneumonia at the worst, and returned home having been told she had a very rare form of lung cancer. They gave her 3 months to live. She lived for 3 years, much of that time with one lung. And so she died when I was 13, and the sun rose and set with my mom. And I entered into my adolescence feeling if continuing to live wasn't going to be impossible, it was going to be highly improbable. So I navigated high school with a lot of overachieving. I spent my days getting straight A's and working 3 jobs, and I spent my nights planning on how I could end my life without causing my older brother, who'd always been my protector and my role model, too much pain. I did make it through high school, and then I landed in college, and I found myself sitting in one of those very large lecture halls. And my professor at the time, Professor Richard Applebaum, was talking to us about suffering on this one particular morning. In particular, he was talking about homelessness. And he was talking about it in a way that allowed time to stand still for me. He was building on what so many traditions have taught us for the beginning of time, really, that in life, it is said, there's equal measure of brutality and beauty, of pain and pleasure, of annihilating moments and of sublime moments. And yet there was a way he was talking about it, this whole conversation about equanimity, that was completely new to me. Because during those 3 years when my brother and I were taking care of our mom, we were surrounded by a number of very, very loving people and kind people who gave us a lot of support for appearing to be stoic, for seeming to be strong, and for holding it all together. And what Professor Applebaum was talking about on that morning is when one is engaged in suffering, there is so much more to it than holding it all together. So what I knew was I wanted more of whatever he had going on. So I went up to him after class, asked how I could help. He scribbled on a piece of paper the name and number of our local homeless shelter's director. And that's when I started volunteering at age 18, spending the nights regularly volunteering in a homeless shelter. I went on to work with all forms of trauma, and always within this kind of larger backdrop of systematic oppression and liberation theory. And what I knew was that I was so grateful that I had found something that made sense to me and that I felt passionate about. What I had no idea and wouldn't know for years to come was to what degree, having borne witness to the suffering of my mom and then the subsequent years of bearing witness to so much suffering with so many people, to what degree that was taking a toll on me. And this is something that wise people have passed down for a long time, and we know more and more about now because of the advances in neuroscience and the wonderful research that many of my esteemed colleagues are doing. But at the time, I had no idea about this cumulative toll. So one of the ways that the toll can show up is for those of you who are doing work. There are folks who do work, and as a result of the work you do, you might be exposed to things, either because of the content of what you're doing, but what a lot of my colleagues say is like, look, the work itself is the least of my concern. It's all my colleagues who put me over the edge, right? So sometimes the toll is because of the work. Sometimes the toll is because of the caretaking we do on our lives. Here she's saying, I feel like I need you less and less, Mom, now that I can make myself feel guilty all on my own. So much of the toll we feel is because many, many, many of you are caretaking in your personal lives. You're caretaking those around you. You're at home tending for folks who are returning from wars, folks who are ill, people who are in need in the community. Sometimes the toll we feel is because of the suffering of other living beings. This is Chris Jordan's wonderful work. And sometimes it's because of what's going on ecologically on the planet itself. This is the work of Vance Friedenberg. He's one of the leading scientists looking at the sixth mass extinction. But what we know is that when humans are exposed to suffering, hardship, crisis, trauma of humans, other living beings, or the planet itself, there's a cumulative toll. And there's a toll on us individually. There's a toll on your immediate relationships. There's a toll organizationally for those of you who have this exposure in your work. Institutionally, systemically, we see it in movements we're a part of. We're seeing it throughout all of our communities and society as a whole. She's saying, speaking personally, I haven't had my day, and I've never met any dog who has. The other piece of this that's very important, at least when I do this work, is it's always held in a larger context of systematic oppression. You know this so well, but a reminder that the degree to which you're impacted by the lives you're living and the work you're doing is intimately tied to the fact that we're in a society with so much supremacy. And if we're in a society where there's no oppression, there's no racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, classism, and xenophobia, so much of the suffering we are tending to wouldn't exist, and the remaining bits that exist in life, we would all be affected by that so differently. I have no doubt that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day. And that for those of you who know what this toll is, and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face, doing that, hey, Laura, you're tripping. You should take some time off. And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. Survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was doing God's work. You could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not going to have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my job. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted. I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised. We took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs. Right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to others suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff? And would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation. Because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately it was my stepfather-in-law who said, are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you? And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, oh, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go to a playground. It's just a lovely place for children. You're not worried about like head injuries or Amber Alerts, right? So, but this is what happens, that over time, what you're exposed to affects your entire worldview.
This is the bariatric gelatin bedtime recipe that took me from 198 to 147. It's natural, simple.
There's so many ways that we can be affected individually and collectively by exposure to vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. Many people call it many different things, but this exposure affects all of us so differently. What I have found through the privilege of getting to work with everyone from zookeepers to judges, school teachers to nurses, ecologists to activists, is that it is breathtaking, the commonalities of how one is affected, right? So some of the ways we find where you feel like you're not doing enough, right? So here they're saying we just haven't been flapping them hard enough. So this is where you feel like you're not doing enough. You constantly feel like you should be doing more, right? Another one could be morale. So they're saying, I see you've done time, so working in a cubicle shouldn't be a problem. So I work with organizations nationally, internationally, and one of the things we find so much is the morale, the very, very quickly eroding morale. Okay. Here he's saying, I bark at everything. You can't go wrong that way. So hypervigilance, many people can relate to a sense of hypervigilance. This is where you lose your ability to flow in, really fluidly in between your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. You become in kind of in hyper arousal. I had a colleague say to me, she was a child support enforcement officer, and she said to me, I can tell you which ones of my son's friends are going to grow up to not pay their child support. And her son was 5 years old, right? Here he's saying, no, not there, please. That's where I'm going to put my head. So exhaustion is something many people can relate to. And not the exhaustion before you work out, but this is an exhaustion where you are tired in your soul, you are tired in your spirit, you are tired throughout your bone marrow. All of your ancestors were tired people, right? There's the avoidance. He's saying, no, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you? This is where the best part of your day at work is where you don't have to do your job, right? And then there's the avoidance in our personal lives. She's saying, it's too late, Roger. They've seen us. Cynicism, many of you can relate to. They're saying, but she'll come down eventually, and she'll come down hard. So what many of you might be able to relate to is not the pure cynicism, but the cynical humor, right? And then anger and rage. He's saying it's a new antidepressant. Instead of swallowing it, you throw it at anyone who appears to be having a good time. And here he's saying, I can cure your back problem, but there's a risk you'll be left with nothing to talk about. So the other thing we see here is the externalizing that happens when more and more people are asked to do more with fewer resources. We see this whole seduction to externalizing. So this is where you start saying to yourself, I would actually be fine taking care of my loved ones if I could have different loved ones to take care of. Or people say, I would love coming to my job every day if my immediate supervisor would just retire, right? And then there's blind spots that we have. So one of the things that we notice a lot that people have is blind spots. I'll share the story to illustrate it. This is a water bottle. It says the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. It's one of approximately, over 100 water bottles I have in my home that have been gifted to me, like incredible programs that many of you are involved with, right? And every water bottle I have in my home has something stenciled on the side like this, which has, domestic violence, sexual assault, HIV/AIDS, infant mortality, flood, hurricane, tornado, tsunami, death, destruction, right? And I'm just thinking, this is great. I got water bottles. Every day is Earth Day here. This is fantastic. But what it also means is these are the water bottles that go with my kids to swim meets, basketball tournaments, soccer games, right? And I'm not thinking anything of it. But then I was unpacking my child's lunch some time ago, and I noticed that at school, she found the provisions to kind of hack over the word sexual, right? So she's not exactly old enough to know what sexual violence is. She's definitely old enough to know you're not sitting at the lunch table at school with a water bottle that says domestic and sexual violence on it, right? I don't know why, but I decided to tell this story at a very large conference of police officers. And when the break came, a police officer came up to me 2 centimeters from my face, $20 in her hand, and said, go get your kid a proper water bottle. I feel like, things have gone very wrong in life when you've got the cops giving you cash, instructing you on parenting, right? And then dogma and self-righteousness, okay? So here he's saying, your mother and I are separating because I want what's best for the country, and your mother doesn't. And then addictions, which many of us can relate to. She's saying, of course I drink during the day. I'm way too tired to drink at night. And numbing. So here he's saying, could we up the dosage? I still have feelings. One of the things I want to say to us about numbing, it is incredibly seductive with the volume and the intensity of suffering on the planet today. It is incredibly tempting and seductive to become numb. And what I want to offer to you is how critical it is that we continue to strive to cultivate our capacity to be present. One of the reasons we want so much to be present is we remind ourselves with everything that is out of our control every single day, one of the things that remains in our control at any given time is your ability to bring your exquisite quality of presence to what you are doing and to how you are being. That presence we know can interrupt the systematic oppression which is causing so much harm and can transform the trauma that is arising. It is very easy to get in that place of you have no idea what my life, if you lived here, if you did my job, if you saw what I saw. And that's when we call on our ancestors. And that's when we call on so many people who have come before us who remind us that when they could not change anything external, they were able to shift everything as a result of where they put their focus. And again, I don't know any of you personally, but the assumption I'm going to make is none of us would go up against any of these folks, right? We're not going to, oh, Desmond, I know things got rough for you in South Africa, what with apartheid and all, but here in Washington State, we got a few things going on, right? Here he's saying, this is the barn where we keep our feelings. If a feeling comes to you, bring it here and lock it up. The other reason I want to bring us back to presence is I want to remind you that while I know we have so many different life circumstances, I believe we have a shared ethic of doing no harm. If you are numb, you will not be able to gauge whether or not you're doing harm. And if we believe in what Chief Sealth talks about with the web of life, or what Martin Luther King talked about with a single garment of destiny, you all know so well that there are so many parts of this web that are profoundly compromised. And many of you are bringing heart and soul to tremendous sacrifice to tend to parts of this web that are compromised. If the way you're doing that out there means in any way you are neglecting your immediate part of the web, cutting off circulation to your immediate part of the web, lighting your immediate part of the web on fire, it is not ethical practice, it's not integrity-based practice, it's not sustainable. The other piece with numbing out, and what we've learned from so many people who've come before us and in so many traditions, is you don't get to selectively numb. So if you're going to numb out your sorrow, you're also going to numb out any possible happiness you can have. If you are going to numb out the heartbreak, you're going to numb out any ability to survive, noticing what is beautiful. And the other thing is your mind and body and spirit will keep trying to bring itself back to a full range of feelings of that whole equanimity and that spaciousness. Which means that's why, you can work on coalition after coalition of peace building, and then you get in the lunch line or on the freeway and you don't let anybody merge in front of you, right? And we defend that. We say how I conduct myself on that freeway or when I'm getting my food at lunch has nothing to do with the other work I'm doing. Howard Thurman reminds us, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and then go and do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So we remember that with the magnitude of suffering at play on the planet right now, we are in desperate need of folks who have the wherewithal and who have the courage to be present. We know from that place of presence, it is possible to aspire to do no harm. It is possible to transform whatever trauma arises, and it is possible to continue to work to dismantle the systematic oppression which is causing such a legacy of suffering. From that place of presence, we know that it is possible to metabolize whatever arises in life, the waves of life, which will continue to present to us what they present. There is a way to metabolize that and integrate it so that over time you find that it contributes to your awakening. That the longer we get to walk on this planet, we find we have deeper compassion, vaster humility, and we are able to come up and out of the narrow places. And from that place of cultivated presence, we remember that it is possible to create and to sustain an ability to be truly transformative. Thank you.
Let me get off mute. That was great. So Laura, I believe, is here with us. And before we start the Q&A, I will introduce her. But I also wanted to let all of you attendees know, Laura would like to see the faces of people that she's talking to. So although we're in a Zoom webinar, I think we're going to be able to switch you all kind of to panelists to give you the option to turn on your cameras so that she can have an actual conversation with the group. So we'll do that here momentarily. I just wanted to give everybody a heads up. Okay. So I'm going to introduce Laura. Child serving professionals in caregiving roles, especially those in child welfare and mental health, carry the profound responsibility of supporting children and families impacted by trauma, separation, and loss. In doing this work, you are often asked not only to respond to crisis, but to bear witness to suffering day after day. Over time, that exposure can take a real toll. Today's speaker has spent decades helping caregivers understand how to sustain themselves in this work without losing their compassion, clarity, or sense of purpose. Laura Dernoot Lipsky is widely recognized as a pioneer in the field of trauma exposure. She has worked nationally and internationally for more than 3 decades, supporting those on the front lines of crisis and care. Through her work, Laura offers a powerful framework for understanding trauma exposure response and for sustaining compassion while doing difficult, necessary work in the world. Please join me in welcoming Laura.
Hi, everyone. I had to move offices last minute, so give me 20 seconds and I'll get
That's
into this new
okay.
office.
Thank you.
Hi there. Sorry, little office reshuffling. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone.
That's okay. Hi.
How's
Thanks for being here
everyone?
with us, Laura.
Thanks for having me. Thanks so much for having me. Like you
Yes,
said, I love pretending like we're in person. So anyone who
yes.
can have their camera on, even if you're multitasking, it's totally fine. But I just like to pretend we're sitting around together like we used to do back in the day.
Yes,
But you're welcome to multitask, of course.
great. Well, and I ask all of our attendees if you have questions for Laura, please put them in the chat. We've got some to get the conversation started, but then if I see any other ones come through the chat, then I will make sure to ask those ones as well. So let me find my first question here, Laura.
And folks can come on mic as well, right? Are they able to come
Yeah,
on mic if they
that's
want? Okay.
true. Yep.
Okay.
Now that we've switched them all the panelists, yeah, you can come unmiked or raise your hand and I'll call on you. That would work great too.
Okay.
So we'll start with Laura, what are early signs of trauma exposure response that professionals should pay attention to before they reach burnout or compassion fatigue?
Great question. So, some is what you just saw in that TED Talk, and then the other ones are what I think Molly and Aaron, you shared with folks that circle, right? The newer circle
Yes.
that we've augmented over the last few years. So there's more on there. So the others are on there. So hopefully you all have access to that. And if not, it's on our website, Trauma Stewardship, if you need to find it quickly, but it's in the handout section. So that's what we call the trauma exposure response. And it's some of what you just heard, some of the ones we've added in more recent years. Negativity bias, for example, that you have a hard time assuming well about others. So obviously that's the United States on steroids. When you want to think about kind of how it is in your own life too, this is what many people will say is I used to never be a glass is half empty person. And now I'm definitely a glass is half empty person, right? So this is where, again, our society is all about this, right? Like good, bad, right, wrong, you're with us, you're against us, like no ability to assume well. But in your own life, it's, somebody goes to say something in a staff meeting and you're just like, oh, what's this jackass gonna say now? Or you get a text from your sister-in-law and you're like, oh, like you're just like no ability to assume well. So that's something that we've added more recently. We added lack of awe. So I'm sure everyone joining us today is a very grateful person, like in your brain and your mind and your spirit. I'm sure you're all very grateful. Lack of awe is where kind of nothing takes your breath away anymore. Like you don't, it's like, you can be spending time with your nephew and obviously you love your nephew, but you're not like really feeling it, or there's a beautiful sunrise and you clock like pretty sunrise, but you're not really feeling it. So lack of awe it's a pretty easy one to measure in ourselves. And then there's kind of the classics that were on there. So feeling like you can't do enough, feeling like you should be doing more. I mean, we're definitely talking more about confirmation bias now as well. That's kind of where just the craving of dopamine, again, that's where you kind of, when you feel like the ground is shifting a lot, you want very solid, like it's a natural thing to want very solid, terrain under your feet. So this is where you can get very opinionated, very, very dogmatic. And then the more we know about confirmation bias and we understand how the brain works and the dopamine seeking. So that's where your like workplace starts to feel very bad middle schooly. This is an executive director I worked with in the Midwest who said, honestly, I only go to my colleagues now and ask their thoughts from the ones I know who are going to agree with me, because I don't have like any energy to deal with anybody who disagrees with me anymore. So that's another one. So those are some of what's on there, but hopefully, given that you've given folks that circle, they can also read through and anything else on there. I just don't want to be redundant from the TED Talk.
And we just put the handouts in the chat, but yes, we did
Okay,
send
great.
those out ahead of time a day or two ago. So now you've got them twice, which is great.
Great.
I'm not yet seeing any hands, but if you wanted to come on off mute and ask a question, can feel free to do so now. Otherwise, we'll kind of keep posing some of the ones that we came up with. I don't think I see any in the chat either. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my questions. So many practitioners struggle with maintaining empathy while also protecting themselves emotionally. How can professionals stay deeply compassionate without becoming overwhelmed by the trauma they witness?
Okay, another wonderful question. So, I mean, my assumption, I don't know any of you personally, but my assumption is that you all are probably short on time, energy, capacity, maybe inspiration, cash. If any of you have like a lot of time, tons of money, email me separately and I can offer you additional strategies. But when I usually work with folks, I'm usually very much focused on kind of desperate times, desperate measures strategies, just assuming that you guys are just don't, I mean, you've got so much that you're navigating. Excuse me. Because of that, where I usually really focus is in people's nervous systems. That's what I usually try to talk with people about, is their nervous systems. And when I'm talking about nervous system, I'm talking about like your nervous system, okay? So your own nervous system. But I also like to think that like where you live has a nervous system, where you work has a nervous system, your neighborhood has a nervous system, right? Different places you spend time have nervous systems. Those third places have nervous systems. So if you imagine your nervous system, and then there's all these nervous systems that are kind of interwoven to this web of life. And as you're going through your day, part of what's happening because of life exposure, let's use waves as a metaphor, wave after wave after wave is happening in your day. That's just life exposure. And your nervous system always is going to be trying to clock and register and see what's happening with these waves. This is just, your mom has Alzheimer's, your kid's in 6th grade, you've got all this stuff happening at work, then you're following what's going on around the world, then you go back, just all day, you're triaging things. For many of those things, your brain is going to do top-down brain processing, where your brain's going to be like, you're fine, you got it, you've done this a million times, you don't need me. And your brain's kind of just kicked back, relax. But for some of these things that happen in your day, your brain is going to register like, hey, perceived threat. Like something is going to meet a threshold for you where there's going to be a perceived threat, even deeply unconscious in your brain. It's personal and it's subjective. So what might meet the threshold for me where I might be really riled up, you all could be like, Laura, chill out for God's sakes, right? So it's personal and it's subjective. But when that threshold is met in your day, when something presents where your brain perceives it as perceived threat, potentially threatening, overwhelming, this energy comes into your nervous system, activates your fight, flight, freeze response. And then because we don't have animals in the wild fare well as long as they're able to do their whole fight, flight, freeze, in part because they don't have the mid-prefrontal cortex. We have the mid-prefrontal cortex. So if you're over the age of 25, when this energy comes into your body, trying to help you deal with whatever you're trying to deal with, right? If you're over 25 and if everything is solid, post-adolescent wise in your brain, a voice is going to tell you to hold it together. which is executive functioning, which is impulse control, which we love executive functioning. But for these purposes, you have to understand it's like a braking mechanism. So now you have all this energy that has come into your nervous system trying to help you deal with whatever 8 million things you've got going on that day. And you've got a loud voice telling you to hold it together. Okay. What we look at when we look at how to sustain, and with your question, we look at what conditions can you create? What conditions are there? Ideally at your workplace, ideally, because we don't want this to become a whole individual thing for your nights and weekends, right? But then we also want to make sure we've got, maximum capacity for this. So we want to cultivate it in our life as well. We look at what conditions have you created that allow you to metabolize what is happening in your nervous system. Essentially, you have to be able to have a conversation with your mid-prefrontal cortex, like, I love you, thank you for gifting me with executive functioning, thank God. And in this instance, I need to intentionally override you. And if you don't have that in place where you're able to override intentionally, mindfully, deliberately, if you don't have those conditions in place that help you metabolize, you all can imagine how few waves have to happen in your day. I mean, really how little has to happen in your day before it starts accumulating throughout your nervous system. And it just builds and builds and builds and builds, and you become saturated. Mm-hmm. Now, many of you are quickly connecting the dots and might be thinking, hey lady, before I ever started doing any of this, I was saturated. Because if you had an upbringing that was filled with anything other than like unicorns, most of us enter like late adolescence pretty saturated. You can believe in what's happening present day. You can believe in the last few years. You can believe in how you were raised. Many of you might believe in intergenerational transmission of trauma and oppression and epigenetics. But regardless, I know very few people who get out of adolescence not being pretty saturated already. So then you go into the rest of your life and you've got your big lives and you've got your caretaking at home and your jobs and your activism and all the ways you care for people and all that. You can imagine it takes very few of these waves meeting that threshold before, if you don't have conditions in place to metabolize, you become saturated. So part of what's hard with saturation is what was talked about in the TED Talk, right? Like the trauma exposure response, you feel numb, you feel like you can't do enough, you're cynical, you're angry, you feel dissociated, you reach for addictions, all of that. But the other thing is no matter how much like saturation sucks, and it does, as humans, we don't stay saturated. What will happen is you'll rupture. So I don't know any of you personally, again, so I can't reference people with charming examples of who ruptures internally or externally, but some of you might be more prone to rupturing internally. Like you're anxious, you don't sleep well, it eats away at you, right? And then others of you rupture externally. You're kind of a pain in the ass at the coffee shop, you don't let somebody merge in front of you on the freeway, and what most of us do is we just oscillate, you know what I mean? Like you're sick to your stomach, and then you're also just kind of like a nightmare, okay? So when we think about how do we sustain, part of what we're wanting to do, like in life, is you're bearing witness. You're helping interrupt isolation. You're showing up for the people you care about. You're doing your jobs. You're working for social and environmental justice, however you consider that, whatever it is. But to be able to sustain oneself, it means you have a way of showing up moment after moment after moment after moment with your presence, but not with absorbing everything that you're bearing witness to, not with letting your nervous system take all of this in and accumulate to the point where you're saturated. And then again, not just that, then you're in a cycle of saturation, rupture, saturation, rupture, saturation, rupture. So I don't know if that resonates with folks. Like, I don't know if we take a moment and pause and you can reflect on, like, can you relate to being in a saturated nervous system and a rupturing nervous system? Like, have you ever been in a household or a family where there's saturation and rupture? Are any of you living in neighborhoods where there's saturation and rupture? Can you relate to this in your workplace where you're part of a team, a unit, a department with saturated and there's rupture? I mean, on behalf of our country, obviously, we're completely hemorrhaging out. So, I mean, I think that like that's the way to kind of, you want to think about like the micro and then the macro levels of that. So ideally for long-term sustainability, you're thinking like, okay, what can I do every day to show up and to be very intentional about what comes into my nervous system, how I'm metabolizing that, how I'm limiting exposure and metabolizing. That's what you're kind of those two paths in front of you.
Yeah, I don't know about anybody else, but saturation definitely resonates with me. It just feels like you can't possibly take any more. Like, and I think I would be an external, what was the word you got? Like
Rupture.
blowing up, rupture, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
blowing up.
yeah.
I saw a question in the chat, so we'll go to that one. Thank you, Megan. How do you protect yourself and protect clients when faced with other professionals with trauma-related harmful external symptoms like persistent negativity, cynicism, and numbness?
Um, I mean, this is such a good question. I do want to make sure, I know we have this Q&A format now, and for anything I don't answer fully or completely, or that might need more nuance, perhaps like this question, I do want to make sure, Molly and Aaron, you can make sure people have my contact information, so the website and my email and everything, and
Okay.
I'm happy to
Yeah.
connect with people after. And part I say that with this question because so much has to do, I mean, there's so many layers to it in terms of, you know, are you a part of a hierarchy? Like, what's the relationship with everyone?
Mm,
How much kind of what's your risk tolerance for engaging in conversations? Um, I think that, I mean, when possible, I think it is. You're always welcome to use me and my work and the book and the handouts, and you're always welcome to like use me as opposed to like putting yourself out there in terms of like, like for this example, if you notice that like 60% of your team is getting just way more cynical, way more jaded, people are just talking shit all the time, whatever it is, you might initiate a staff conversation like, hey, this person's work was brought to me recently. Don't know what you think about it. Let's just like open to the chapter on cynicism. Like part of the way the book was written with all the New Yorker cartoons also is kind of in a way to kind of help diffuse things a little bit. We have all these handouts for those purposes too. And because you all are working with your colleagues and I'm somebody from the outside. So in any way, if that's helpful to ever just be like, what do you think of that? Just kind of like weave it in so it can be less here's me, Jennifer, having a conversation with you by the water cooler
mm.
about your attitude. It can be like trying to be strategic there. So that's one thing. Always welcome to do that and just be like, I don't know, she seems kooky, but what do you think about this? I think the other thing that can be helpful, again, in the spirit of just trying to help, when people are tired and when people are drained and when people feel depleted, we often have a tendency to be more defensive and defended and have kind of more architecture up than we otherwise would. So I think it can be helpful, like the kind of our latest, that trauma exposure response that has a lot of things on there. I think being able to use that in a conversation, like, can I check in with you about this? Like, as opposed to just like, Elizabeth, I don't know what's up with you recently, but just like, hey, there's some things I'm noticing. What do you think about this? And it's a part of something called a trauma exposure response, right? It's not just like Jorge with a bad attitude. So, I mean, I think trying to be, and part of the reason I'm saying that is I am just finding that folks are, very maxed out generally and quite on edge generally. And I'm not noticing like a trending towards people having more internal spaciousness and more ability to self-reflect and more introspection and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I'm not talking about like walking on eggshells at all. And I'm not talking about being indirect either, but just being very intentional, being very mindful about how we have these conversations. I also think the last thing I would say to that question is honestly, I mean, the amount of time I've been negative, the amount of time I've been cynical, the amount of time I've talked to what. So for me with colleagues, it's always really easy to lead in with, "Hey guys,
Mm.
I know that like I've really been like on one recently about X, Y, or Z. My bad. I feel like not really contributing to the morale we need. Like there's nothing quite like putting yourself out there in terms of just like, hey, it's come to my attention that I've been sub awesome recently and really quite unimpeccable with my speech, conduct, and action. So I'm sorry, like, and kind of trying to lead in with some self-reflection too.
Yeah, modeling the behavior. Okay, let me see. I'm going to ask one of our questions. Self-care is often emphasized, but it can sometimes feel like the responsibility falls entirely on individuals. What are organizational practices or policies that agencies can adopt to better support trauma stewardship among staff?
Yeah, so that's such an important question, and what I was going to wanted to mention earlier, but I mean, I never talk about things in terms of self-care, and I say that respectfully, but I don't use that language, and that's very intentional. There's a couple of reasons why. One of the most important reasons is I believe that the systems and the structures where we work have a moral mandate and an ethical obligation to create sustainable environments where we are learning and where we are working. So it is very important to me. Well, I never want to, I mean, we're all adults. We all elected to do this work. So it is our responsibility to show up and bring our A game every day, right? And we get to make choices, and we're here because we've chosen to be here. So I'm not in any way trying to take away our accountability or our responsibility, as Stevie Wonder said, to handle your business. I'm not trying to take that away. Also, when I work with folks, I never want people leaving my presence feeling, first of all, that they have a massive to-do list, because I just think with people's lives, it's just unrealistic that folks are going to add much more to their like overflowing to-do list. And also, I don't want it to be reductive. I don't want it to be flattened. I don't want it to be like this whole just individual pursuit only of like, okay, everyone, let's work on turning our frowns upside down now, so I don't want it to go that direction. I also want to be very mindful of the capitalistic nature that is an undercurrent right now with a lot of self-care. So while I'm not taking away our accountability and our responsibility to do what we need to do and handle our business so we can be as solid as possible, bring our A game, have right speech, right conduct, right action, my focus is very, very much on structurally and systemically, what are we doing? Like, what is happening? And what are the conditions that are created to either help us be able to bring our highest selves to this, or just create, let's assume, well, that's not intentional, but just create tremendous headwinds to us trying to do what we're doing. So there's a few things, again, I mean, these are longer conversations, but to start it, I mean, one of the things that I think is most demoralizing for folks is when there's a sense of over deployment, when people's jobs are a setup in terms of like, given, this is where we talk about burnout too, right? Given the resources you have and the time frame you've been given, there's just no way you can possibly do what you've been asked to do. Right? That's just an invitation for despair and disheartenedness and horrible morale. It's a bit different than vicarious trauma, where we're talking about bearing witness, but they are connected. And I think part of what happens is because society has been so over deployed for so long, and our fields are so over deployed and maxed out. And again, let's assume this well-intentioned here. What happens is agency after organization, after institution, after, system, we keep trying to do more and more and more, but without the resources we need to be able to do that. And what happens is that keeps flowing down to the individual workers. And so then there's this either explicit or implicit communication of like, first of all, if you're tough enough and cool enough and committed enough, suck it up, shut up, put your head down, do your job. But there's also a sense like if you're devoted enough, you're going to figure out how to hack this system somehow. And if you just like, nobody takes time to pee during the day, nobody eats food during the day that you have to chew, like everybody just acts in a hypomanic way, we're going to just get stuff done. And so then it's really, even if it's not explicit, like martyry culture at an organization, there's this internalized sense with a lot of workers of like, there's something wrong with me that I'm not doing this right, And so I think one of the most important things that I think agencies, organizations, institutions, systems can do is be able to be very, very honest. And I think apologies go a long way. I don't mean like an apology, get your legal team involved, like self-deprecating apology. I mean, like, communicate your compassion, communicate your empathy, pull people together and be like, hey, everyone, I'm so sorry. This is a living hell right now. There's more that we don't have the resources to do what we're being asked to do. We're committed in these ways. We don't have the staff we need. There's this going on, like affirm, like interrupt people's isolation around it, right? And then be able to, not have it just one of the things that's very dangerous with trauma and vicarious trauma is people thinking like it's just in my head, right? Like, it's just like, am I the only one? Like, am I the only one who's having this hard of a time? So being able to say, like, we recognize the landscape is out of control. Like, this is bananas. Then move into gratitude. Grateful for you, a lot of gratitude, right? And then be able to, like, I think the least we can do, agency, organization, system-wise, be honest with folks about what's going to change and what's not going to change. This is the other thing that I think gets very problematic in our systems is, and we've all done this in different ways, I think, or we've all seen this happen, where it's just like, oh gosh, this fiscal year was hard. Let's just get to the next fiscal. Oh no, that didn't get any better. Okay, after the fundraiser. Oh wait, no, that didn't work. Okay, after this one thing, like, we keep doing this thing. It's just like, hold on. And I think it's very powerful for leadership and others. It doesn't have to be leadership to be able to say, here's what's changing and here's what's not changing. And, like, kind of the least, like, give people, humans, when things are overwhelming like they are right now, we need accurate, forthright, clear, transparent, honest information. Otherwise, things do not go well. And then once you give your colleagues that, then they can make decisions. Do I stay? Do I go? Do I recalibrate? What is this going to look like? But when it's just kind of this very vague, be proud of the work we're doing. We so appreciate your devotion. Obviously, you're all working more, but you're not getting paid. But, it gets so problematic, and it gets problematic in many ways. It also really, really gets very problematic. And for any of you who are doing this work from a place of social justice, for any of you who believe that, so much of what the harm that you all are tending to daily, what's causing that is structural supremacy and systematic oppression, then you really appreciate that you cannot be dismantling that out in society and then having us replicate it in our systems. And even if it's in very small, seemingly small ways of like, well, this is exciting. April's coming up. We always do our employee recognition event. Like, Matthew, you're the employee of the year. Thanks for never calling in sick. We heard you had COVID, shingles, and mono, but you never called in sick. Here's a plaque. Like, that's what we're not going for, And again, so I think I'm not trying to be reductive about this too, because I know, like, can be a lot of complexity in systems, but I always think we have the option of being honest. Like, we always have the option of being able to be like, hey, everyone, we're way in over our heads, like way in over our heads, and we just want to be honest with you about that. Like, that's different than just like, okay, who's positive today,
Yeah. Oh, so many things you said just like hit me right in the gut. Natasha, I see your hand is raised. Are you able to unmute? Okay, well, we'll work on that. We have another question in the chat, though. How can workers learn to say no without feeling guilty or not wanting others to become upset for saying no when we are busy and overwhelmed with other tasks that need priority attention first?
Well, all right. So the long answer to this, I mean, and I think what underlies a lot of this is, and without getting like hyper clinical, is just being able to ask ourselves, like, okay, if I'm about to say no in this moment, like, what am I most anxious about? What's most stressful? Oh, it's about disappointing somebody. It's about, I don't want to be in trouble. I don't want somebody mad at me. I don't want somebody, whatever. Again, then without getting hyperclinical and like entering into like 80 years of psychotherapy, which we could all do, then you kind of just take a moment and ask yourself, When's the first time I felt this? What is this reminding me of? Try to like just do a really quick insight check within yourself about like, oh, this reminds me of my coach in second grade who always acted disappointed. Oh, this is my narcissistic father. This is whatever. Like, we're in 2026, right? We really should be able to like have the skills to be able to say, no, I can't do that right now. I'm so sorry. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for da 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 da. When we kind of get into this place of just like freezing around it and inability, and we get very fraught with it, again, without knowing any of you personally, I would venture that most of that is not because of present day stuff. I mean, maybe you've got a boss who's like a nightmare and like is just like always tripping about stuff, or maybe you've got like some other extenuating circumstances. But for most of us, when we're this age and when we're kind of bound by things, a lot of it has to do with back in the day. So I think it can be helpful. Again, it doesn't have to be a massive thing, but just like take a second, inhale, exhale. What is this feeling reminding me of? That I'm going to be in trouble, that I'm disappointing somebody, that something bad's going to happen. Oh yeah, right. Yeah, my mom was an alcoholic and I took care of my 3 siblings. Just like connect it to something and be like, right. And then like look out the window, feel the ground under your feet, touch your desk or something and be like, this is 2026. This isn't, that was then, this is now. And it's okay for me to say no to this, right? Then there's kind of the practice of like developing skills about how to say no and everything. I think something that a lot of people appreciate is the idea of just not having the capacity, right? And so I'm not encouraging any of you to like get on a whole self-effacing trip or anything, but I think sometimes when we're asked to do something, we're invited to do something, something's proposed. I think when we tell people like, I appreciate the invitation. Thank you for I mean, unless it's just something you shouldn't appreciate the invitation for, but otherwise, let's assume then being able to say like, hear you, appreciate it, da, 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 da. Like, honestly, I do not have the capacity for that, right? Like, I don't have the capacity for it and I don't have the capacity to do it well right now, So kind of then having like some skill about how to do it. But I think a lot of times when we get into this thing, like, I can't say no, it's because it's bringing up stuff from other times. Not always, but that's often what like the loudest voice in our head is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Natasha's hand, I do see that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Natasha.
Oh, hello. I couldn't not take this opportunity, and I don't know that it's going to let me do my camera, but so you just have to hear my voice. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We have been showing your TED Talk for 40 cohorts in. So for a class on resiliency that we do.
Mm. Oh, you're back mute again, Natasha.
I promoted her to panelist, so she.
Yay.
Oh, hi. Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Hello.
Awesome.
And so we teach resiliency to the workforce, child welfare workforce. And so what I appreciate, and there's so much validation happening here that I think many of us are probably feeling because we're all in this together, right? But this sense of teaching resiliency to direct service to supervisors and not getting the validation of no human being can do this all day, every day at the level that you're being asked. And as you were saying, agencies and the systems and the organizations and the institution, there's such a fear between just acknowledging that or owning that. And as we share space with developing workforce in a healthier way, any tips or suggestions for how to almost, give permission or build collaboration with these decision makers and administrators at this cultural level to give permission that what does success look like to be working alongside families and promoting their well-being and workforce well-being. Because this, I'm often coaching workforce and being like, what is success? And maybe success isn't going to be here for you because you're so much in your STS, we just see it coming up so often in their day-to-day work and that whole prevention of not doing harm in the work. And we see people coming to us that just don't know how to get out of it. So then you teach resiliency skills, then at the same time, is there a price to resiliency? You know what I mean? Sorry, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but just
No.
how Does that make sense? Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think there's a few. I'll answer just like a few things, and then again, Natasha, I'll make sure. So my contact information, you can find me through the website, which is traumastewardship.com, and my direct email is laura@traumastewardship.com. So anything that doesn't get fully answered today, please feel free to follow up with me. I mean, I think there's a few things. I think the resiliency. This is where I think there can be a benefit in talking about resiliency and working on resiliency. And also, I think, as you're saying, of course, if we're not mindful about the systems and the structures and the headwinds and the just inherent inability to do what we're being asked to do because of the structural setup, then I think it really gets into messing with people's minds. So I think that's one thing, is understanding the discernment between vicarious trauma and burnout, right? They are separate things. So vicarious trauma, you are exposed over times to suffering, hardship, crisis, trauma of humans, other living beings, the planet itself. And as a result of bearing witness to really hard things, you change over time. Separate from, different from, but connected to burnout. Burnout is where you're being asked to do something you cannot possibly do with the resources you have in the time frame you've been given in the way that you want to do it. All right. Vicarious trauma, it's just going to be a reality and a lot of work. And there should be scaffolding and there should be support and we should talk about it. And when you go into any number of work and just living in society today, there's going to be vicarious trauma. Burnout is not, burnout doesn't have to be. Burnout happens, right? Because we're in an deployed society. Systems get overdeployed, agencies, organizations get overdeployed, and then we as workers get overdeployed. So that burnout to me is like infuriating in that way, in that it's something that we participate in constructing. And again, I understand the well-intentionedness of like, well, what are we going to say no to these folks? And are we not going to help these people, and etc. But what happens then is the people who ultimately, of course, end up suffering are the folks we're serving. Because then the second people who end up suffering are the workers who just can't keep up. And then you have the trauma exposure response happen. Right? Like when you're working with workers who are cynical or numb or jaded or talking shit about their clients, or they're they're getting high in their break. That's not how anybody started out. But when humans are maxed out and saturated, there's going to be rupture. And what happens, it's not just individual, but like a whole team becomes like that, a whole department. It's why, I talk so frequently about the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, which is, they still are doing unbelievable work. I wrote about them in Trauma Stewardship because they're one of the only organizations I worked with that has made over time a very heartbreaking decision of like, they had to close intake for a while because they just could not keep up with the needs of the folks they were serving, right? And they realized how much harm it was causing. And they got so much flack from community, and it was a very fraught thing and very heartbreaking for them to close their intake for a while. But the director was so clear on the harm that was happening. And I think, to your point, Natasha, I mean, again, this is not to leave us on this note, but so much of my work is getting called in after very, very, very bad things have happened. I mean, there's a million reasons I'm delighted to be with you all today, not the least of which is this is proactive and it's preemptive. I'm not taking away anything you all have going on, but it's a preemptive conversation. And so much of my work is getting called in after horrific things. And a lot of times what happens, to Natasha's point, is that people will be like, we should change something, and it doesn't change, and then God forbid something happens because it's just not sustainable, right? And then everybody's like, oh, now we're going to really change something. So that's why anything we can do to be proactive, anything we can do to be preemptive about this, and be very, in Buddhism, you talk about like wake up to the present moment, be very clear seeing about like, this isn't going to end well. Like, this isn't going well, and this is not going to end well. And you kind of get that feeling of like, we've really got to be proactive and preemptive here, which is hard because our society is very reactive and our fields often are very reactive. And just the reality is, a lot of times you see this all the time with tragedies in schools and workplaces and other, like, things don't change until something horrific happens. So I think that's a lot of what I try to talk with leadership about, is like, you're really on borrowed time here.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Well, I know we're at time. Tara, I see your hand. So Laura, is it okay if Tara's question gets sent to you through your website? Is that the
Yeah, I'm
best
also
way?
happy to take it right now. I mean, we can
Oh,
close out
okay.
with that
I
question.
didn't
Yeah.
know if we had a hard stop. Okay,
No, I'm happy to close out with that question. Yeah.
hopefully, Tara, let's see. I'm going to say click on the allow to talk. So hopefully you can unmute yourself. If Zoom cooperates, you should be able to. And if not, you can put your question in the chat. Or did we lose you? Okay. I'm not hearing Tara. I gave permission to talk. So we might have lost her. Ask to unmute. Okay. Well, Tara, feel free. You can send
Yeah, you can certainly email me, and anybody's
yeah.
welcome to. Yeah, just come through the site, Trauma Stewardship, or you can email me directly, Laura at Trauma Stewardship. But if I can be of any support, there's a lot of infographics on our site. We're always very happy to. I never, ever, ever, ever want finances to be a barrier for anything. So the books were written because people asked me to write the books. I don't care about the finances. We just care about them getting to people who are in need. The handouts are there as resources. So if finances are a barrier to anyone on any level or anyone you know could benefit and it's a barrier, just be in touch with us. We'll always slide the scale down. And there's the infographics, there's our podcast, there's a lot of resources on that site.
Thank you very much, Laura, for being with us today. I'm sure we could talk for many more hours, but we appreciate the time we had with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Maureen
Yes.
and Aaron. Thank you for everything. And take the best of care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Sorry, what's her email? Laura at.
Traumastewardship.com.
Okay. Just Laura?
Laura at
Okay.
traumastewardship.com. Yep.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
have a good day.
You too.
Yep.
How about I'll call you guys on Teams?
Perfect.
Or we can go back to the backstage.
Oh, here, yeah. Go back to backstage.